Make sure it's recording. Give it a few seconds. Continuity, part one. The shots he heard coming from in front of him rolled past. This is like the fifth, literally, maybe the sixth time I've read this. Maybe we'll get it this time. If not, too bad. We'll just have to find another book to read. The shots he heard coming from in front of him rolled past in a dreamy, underwater, slow-motion fashion. The tangled mass of wax myrtle and catbrier shook as the two rustlers desperately attempted to flee the bag they found themselves in, shooting wildly, with the sound of each shot slowly flowing past him. Again, the shotgun came to his shoulder, shoved against him, and he could see the charge of buckshot leaving the tube in a brief spurt of flame and smoke, the pattern beginning to spread before impacting and spinning the rustler into a downward spiral, ending in death. His arm pulled the slide backwards, the spent shell he had no conscious memory of seeing kicked outwards to his right, and his arm pushing the slide forward again to bring the shotgun back into battery. Again the shove and the charge of shot exiting the muzzle, leaping forth, spreading like a lethal rain to impact the boy's torso. The pellets dimpled his clothing and disappeared into his body, causing him to stumble and fall. Again the slide action ejected the spent shell and rammed a fresh one home. Minutes went by as John stepped around the big pine tree to get a clear view, and there on the ground was the boy laying there staring at him intently with an expression that clearly communicated, "You shot me for a cow?" before closing his eyes as if to take no more notice. As if coming from across a vast plain, he heard voices. Some seemed to be the wailing of the damned. Others seemed familiar. Mike, Jimmy, his dad, all calling to him. He felt his voice rumbling upward from his chest, not quite making it, then rumbling forward again. "I'm here. I've got two down." Or was it, "I've got to go down"? He still wasn't sure who he'd been responding to when he awoke. His mouth tasted like the floor. Next paragraph. His mouth tasted like the floor of the hen house, and his head felt dangerously overpressured and at risk of bursting along his cranial sutures. He closed his eyes and laid his head back down on the pillow, a gassy belch bringing the taste of bourbon back into his mouth. That was stupid, he berated himself in the throbbing confines of his head. That whiskey is irreplaceable, and you're still dreaming. It's just a delayed stress reaction. It'll pass in time. He knew he was too awake now to go back to sleep, so he slid out of bed as quietly and tried to focus on the clock radio on the headboard, 4:30 a.m. With the violence of the weather gradually subsiding, the power was staying on for longer stretches, which suited him fine, since he hated listening to the ticking of the big brass wind-up alarm clock, which would have sounded cacophonous in his present state. Of course, if they started power rationing like they were threatening to do, he'd have to suffer with it anyways. Making his way into the bathroom, he voided his bladder, washed his face, and scrubbed his teeth thoroughly to get the hungover taste out of his mouth. He pulled on yesterday's pants and went into the kitchen. He really wanted a couple of ripe bananas to soothe his stomach, but they'd eaten their last banana nearly 3 weeks ago, and God only knew when they'd ever see another one. Bananas would grow here, but they were really still too tropical of a fruit to make more than a novelty, so he never planted any. He made do with a cold glass of water from the fridge and a bowl of cold cereal. Now that he'd become accustomed to drinking the fresh, raw milk they traded eggs for with Ed's wife, he kicked himself for not having done it years sooner. They had goats, but not milking animals. He'd see about changing that when he could. He washed his face again at the kitchen sink, then crept into the bedroom to retrieve his clothes to dress in the living room. He stuck his head in Melinda and Heather's room now, and they were both asleep. There wasn't a spare bed, so rather than share one, the girls had elected to eliminate the bed and make what they called a sleeping nest on the floor. They seemed happy with the arrangement, and it freed up a bed to be used by Lisa Hatcher. They'd given it their best shot, but nothing would convince Luke to leave town. He did, however, readily agree to allow Lisa and Heather to come, and the females were all too happy to make the move. It had been a few years since Lisa had worked in the field, but upon a time, she'd been an RN working in a trauma clinic in Cincinnati, which put her a leg up on anyone else in the neighborhood, in terms of medical skill and experience. When Luke came to UF and made chair, they decided Lisa would stay home and concentrate on home and family, as well as getting serious about a promising writing career. Her third book was to have been published in the fall, but the impact had washed away her publisher when it washed away New York City. As a doctor and department chair, Luke rated a small amount of gasoline each week, which he elected to use in coming out to see his wife and children and catching everyone up on the news. During the week, he slept at the health center in his office, their posh neighborhood having proved to be unsafe when civil order began to decay. So far, he had only managed to make it once, but felt that as the situation settled, he should be able to accomplish the trip more often. No one was sure when it would be safe for his family to move back into town. From what Mike told them, those who could leave Gainesville for a safer place were doing so more poured into the town from everywhere.